This is our last video on Roland Barthes' book Mythologies, and here we'll have a look at the end of the book, which is very political. So in a society, in a capitalist society according to Barthes, we have the bourgeoisie, of course, so the bourgeoisie. There we go. And the bourgeoisie is the upper classes, also to some extent the middle classes. These are the people who own the means of production. And then opposed to them, we have the working classes, the proletariat. And Barthes basically contrasts these two classes. Now, the bourgeoisie, according to Barthes, are the ones who really make most of the myths, and that's because they are in control. But in doing this, they actually tend to hide their purpose. And they don't really come out and say, hey, we are the bourgeoisie. You don't see that name in society. So Barthes talks about how the bourgeoisie ex-nominates itself. Ex-nominates. And what that really just means is it removes its own name. So in government, for instance, it's not like you're going to see a bourgeoisie party. You might have Republicans, conservatives, Democrats, liberals, different types of parties, but those names don't necessarily tell you who is behind it. What you get instead is you get concepts and myths, so things like the nation, right? The nation. And the bourgeoisie wants the proletariat to also have a share in the nation, to feel included, even though, according to Barthes, they are, of course, not. They get things done for them, but they're supposed to believe in this concept of the nation. And there are other concepts as well. So there's the concept of the eternal man, which is the idea here that there is this kind of unchanging notion of what human beings should be, as opposed to more historically varying kinds of people. So the whole point then is that the proletariat is being asked to have a share in the nation, and that this is why Barthes talks about a joint stock company. So capitalism tends to produce a joint stock company. We all have shares in it. And you can really see this in the way in which everybody's supposed to be patriotic and so on. Another example he gives here is of the bourgeoisie wedding. Okay, so if you have a wedding of somebody really rich and famous, there's lots of photos, lots of pictures, and somebody who is making very little money, let's say somebody working as a secretary or somebody working at a checkout counter or something like that, making very little money, can't afford that particular wedding herself, but looks at it and thinks, oh, this is amazing. And so has a kind of fantasy share in that particular experience as well. Might even buy a magazine off the magazine rack and dream and fantasize about this. And according to Barthes, this is very misleading and very fake, right? But it does suggest that in this way, everybody has a share in these types of experiences. So what the bourgeoisie does then is it tends to naturalize its myths. Okay, so it tries to naturalize, make it seem natural, as if this is really how the world is. But Barthes refers to this as a kind of pseudo, so pseudo means false, pseudo-physis. And I probably should have looked up how to pronounce that, but basically physis here means nature. Okay. So a kind of fake nature. You could think of something like fake plants. I really dislike fake plants, actually. Think of plastic, which he actually talks about earlier in the book as well. So all of these things, they're kind of symbolic of this fake nature that you see in every single bourgeois myth. It's not real, right? And the question is, how do we get back to reality? So the rest of the book then tries to juxtapose two ways of creating stories. And the first is the left, okay, so the myths on the left, and then the other one is myths on the right. And the right here is the bourgeoisie. So what Barthes suggests then is that on the left there are virtually no myths. On the left there are no myths, and I think you should be very skeptical about this, as I'll suggest in a bit. But he gives this kind of picture of a woodcutter. Okay, so we'll draw kind of a, I don't know, there you go, there's an axe, and this is the woodcutter. And the woodcutter goes into the forest and cuts down a tree. So a woodcutter here is a producer. Okay, a producer. And when he's cutting down this tree, everything in this book goes back to trees, he's just simply performing an action. He's not creating a myth. He's just doing this for his work and for survival. And the action is transitive, right? Like in grammar, it has an object. So he's being very directly involved with the tree. In fact, Barthes says that when he does this, then he speaks the tree. He acts the object. And what Barthes is really doing here, I think, he's creating a sort of myth, isn't he? He's creating a myth of what true labor is like. So true labor equals nature, going back to nature. It's a labor that suggests action. It's also an aspect of politics. So nature is politics. Okay, if we can only go back to nature, we'll be the most political. And in this way, we can overcome what Marx called alienation. Okay, so no more alienation. There we go. Alienation is gone. We're not in the factory where we are separated from nature, where we're just turning ourselves into a machine. Instead, we are back in nature. Now, all of this then suggests that the woodcutter, the worker, the laborer is more real, more honest, and that's because he has barely any myths. I think you can poke some holes at this. So, for instance, people who work in the countryside, they have all kinds of stories about trees and about forests and about, creatures that might live in them and so on. There are plenty of myths, of course, there as well, but apparently these don't really count. The other thing that you see here is this myth itself, really, of the revolution as being pure. So at one point, Barthes writes, "This is why revolutionary language proper cannot be mythical." And if you ever read Walter Benjamin is another one of these figures early in the 20th century who tries to understand what revolutionary violence is in his case. And he basically says that when people are spontaneously angry, it's a bit like a divine violence that just kind of breaks out all of a sudden, not premeditated in the sense of calculating or anything like that. It's just very, very violent and very pure. So we have a kind of pure violence. And we see that here as well with Barthes, is that he wants a revolutionary language in this case, which simply breaks out, it breaks forth, and it acts, it's pure action, and it's incredibly honest because it doesn't have any myths, or very few myths. Now, maybe you'll agree with me that this is itself a myth, right? The myth of pure action is a myth that he indulges in towards the end of the book. And if we think about other myths on the left, we would see, well, there are actually more myths. So he does refer to Stalin, for instance, right? Myths about Stalin. And there are these questions about, well, can the revolution ever be pure, or does it pretty quickly descend into these other kinds of myths about particular figures in the revolution? I recently also made a video about Georges Sorel, another somewhat Marxist writer from the early 20th century, and he talks about the importance of myth because in order to inspire people to become revolutionaries, you have to kind of say, well, there is this catastrophe at the end where we're going to come to some kind of confrontation between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and then after that the final perfect society will be created. But you can't have people become revolutionaries unless you inspire them with myths, with stories of what that time will be like. So Sorel actually did realize the importance of myth there. You really see the kind of fantastical way of writing when Barthes says that the oppressed person, like the woodcutter, is quasi unable to lie, which is kind of comical, I think, right? If you know what human beings are like, then you know, well, people lie all the time. And it's not as if the people at the bottom are necessarily so much more honest than the people at the top. There are bad people everywhere, basically. That brings us then to myth on the right. And when it comes to the right, according to Barthes, there are many different types of myths, and they tend to follow particular rhetorical strategies. So I'm just going to run through these very, very quickly here. He lists 7, and many of these are also shown in the first part of the book. So if you go back, you're going to see them with different examples there. The first one is inoculation, and this is where you give somebody a vaccine, you give them a little bit of evil in order to protect them from more evil. And the classic example in the first part of the book is Operation Margarine. Why would anybody want to use margarine rather than butter? But by kind of showing a little bit of the evils of margarine in commercials and so on, we say, well, it's obviously not great, but now we're used to it. Now we think, well, it's actually rather versatile and not so bad. We come to terms with it. And so for Barthes, this happens all the time. You see this with the army, with the church, with different state institutions. The state doesn't shy away from showing a little bit of the bad parts, but then we simply get used to it and we accept it. Rhetorical strategy number 2 is privation of history. This is where we focus on generalities. We lose touch with the real history. If you think of tourist guidebooks, for instance, they tend to focus on these kinds of stereotypes, right? What is Spain like? What is France like? Do we really get to know individuals? No, not so much. We tend to get a very stereotyped picture. The third one here is identification. So bourgeois myths want you to identify with anything that's different. So it becomes the same as you. You simply make it the same as you, and then you can accept it. There is one variant of this, which is to do the opposite, to really emphasize the otherness, the difference of whatever you're looking at. And that's where the exotic comes in. So the other becomes a very exotic kind of thing, which is radically different from you. But by stereotyping, again, you are able to master it. I would also suggest that if you want to develop this at greater length, you look up Edward Said, who had a lot to say about Orientalism, which is exactly that second approach of making the other exotic. The fourth rhetorical strategy is tautology, which is a circular kind of reasoning. This is like saying it is what it is. And so myths teach us to simply accept things, well, this is basically how it is. The fifth one is neither norism, and in the first half of the book there's a chapter as well on neither norism types of critics. These are people who say, well, it's not this, it's not that, we're not going to commit to anything, right? Think of like scales, for instance, weighing things in the balance. And this sounds very objective. It's not this, it's not that. But it's basically a way of not choosing, of being non-committal. The sixth one here is quantification of quality, which is quite a mouthful. This is basically just an abundance of special effects. So if you think of like a Disney movie, something like that, it's over the top and it turns the quantity of effects into its own sense of quality. And then the final one here is statement of fact. The myth always wants to say, well, this is how it is. This is the fact. And it tends to do this through maxims and aphorisms, through wise sayings to say, well, this is how the world runs. And then that becomes common sense. Whereas by contrast, the woodcutter, if we go back to the woodcutter figure, might say something like, well, the weather is fine. And the woodcutter would be talking about his specific situation and what his needs are, rather than trying to make these larger statements about all of life and trying to mislead other people. Okay, so we have seen then that we have myth on the right, myth on the left. This is very political, obviously, And Barthes is hoping that the bourgeoisie will one day be toppled, right? The bourgeoisie will be gone and everybody will live happily together, which is itself, as we've said, a myth. Now, as he's talking about this, he recognizes that he himself has to fit into this picture too. He himself is a mythologist, and after reading the book, I think we probably might be mythologists too. But the mythologist is very self-conscious. The mythologist stands at a distance and says, well, I see both sides. I see that you've created a myth, and I see it's not natural. But now that I know that, it's very difficult to go back and enjoy the natural. If we think, for instance, of wine in France, the way in which wine is turned into this mythological thing and what it all represents, well, how do I go back now and enjoy my glass of wine, right? If we have a glass of wine now, there we go, very ugly glass of wine. How am I going to drink this now and enjoy the goodness of wine, because wine still is good, but not be confused or misled by the concept of goodness, the health, the vitality, all these myths kind of surrounding it? How am I going to separate these things? That becomes very, very difficult for the mythologist. And this is why the mythologist has to live vicariously. So the mythologist will need a vicarious experience. Vicarious means living through somebody else. So the mythologist then has to hope that the proletariat will act, because he himself cannot. He's too sarcastic, too distanced. And actually, this is very reminiscent of Georges Sorel, as you'll see if you watch that particular video. But the mythologist then is unable to move or unable to act almost, because he himself has become quite alienated through his process of analysis. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the book. I hope you enjoyed these videos. I hope they allow you to make some sense of the book. It is a fascinating book. It's a book that provides some really brilliant insights into particular cultural rituals. But I think personally, and this is just my opinion, I think sometimes it goes overboard as well with its sarcasm, its suspicion, its lack of trust, and its sense, I think, that what our cultural ways of behaving are always forms of ideology, and this is always about power dynamics. So I think maybe we can be a bit more forgiving and a bit more harmonious in our lives with others. Although Barthes would simply say, well, if you believe that, you're simply indoctrinated. So there's no way out of this particular Marxist perspective. All right, that brings us to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Subscribe to this channel, and I'll be producing more literary theory videos in the future.